Hi everyone, welcome to the May 22nd edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly as usual by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to handicap two tracks. We're going to start out at Churchill Downs and talk about their late pick 5 there on Saturday. I know some of you liked when we went through an entire sequence at Gulfstream Park a few weeks ago, so we're going to do the same thing with this pick 5 sequence, talk about where we're going to lean and just our picks in each race. And then we'll head out to Santa Anita. They've got a couple of turf stakes races there that they're running on Saturday. We'll discuss each of those as well as another maiden race on the card earlier in the day. So, Craig, it's definitely not normal times yet, but it's starting to feel like we're getting back to a bit of a normal race schedule with some of these stakes races happening around the country this weekend.
Yeah, it sure does. I actually kind of tallied it up, and it looks like by mid-June we're going to have at least 20 tracks back running, which is a far cry from just what we had a couple weeks ago. So exciting times. We're still a long way from normal. I'm not sure when we're ever going to see that again, but we certainly have it a lot better than we did back in March and April, and plenty of big races to talk about.
No, it's definitely great to have all of these tracks running, and it's been a great distraction, and I'm sure that will continue to be the case as we get even more going on. And handicapping this late pick 5 sequence at Churchill Downs was definitely a distraction for me because it took a lot of focus. There's a lot going on in many of these races, and we're going to start with arguably one of the more straightforward of the races in this sequence. It's the 7th race beginning this late pick 5, and the Shawnee Stakes going a mile and a 16th for the fillies and mares. This one features the return of a very good horse from last year. Well, a couple of good horses, but Dunbar Road, she was one of the choices in the Breeders' Cup Distaff last year. Didn't really work out for her that day, but she had done some good things going back to the summer of last year, winning the Grade 1 Alabama. This will be her 4-year-old debut, and what do you think we're going to get from her?
I expect a big race from her. When Chad Brown sends him back, he generally sends him back ready to run. You don't get a whole lot of prep races out of him. So if she's as good as she was last year, I fully expect her to win this race. It's a little bit different than the other horse who I guess is the alternative. She's a Julie. She comes out of the Steve Asmussen barn. She also had a very good season last year as a 4-year-old filly. She's a 5-year-old mare now. But Steve Asmussen doesn't really send them out as cranked up. He does okay off the layoff, but it's not really a strong suit of his. He tends to more want to build his horses up in the form, and a lot of his wins come in easier spots than this. So of those two main contenders, I would definitely side with Dunbar Road.
Yeah, I think this is a race where you're going to have to decide whether you want to lean on Dunbar Road and try to spread a little bit later in the sequence, or whether you think Dunbar Road is vulnerable. I was kind of debating between the two camps, and I ended up going a bit more in the direction that I want some backups to Dunbar Road in this race, because while she is the horse to beat, it's not like she's got some massive speed figure edge over this field. Now, she might just improve with natural maturity from 3 years old to 4 years old, but she's not a horse that possesses a ton of early speed, and if you look at this pace projector, I think that it's worth pointing out that the two horses that are projected to be up front, they could be dangerous in this race. I mean, one of them is obviously the number 8, She's a Julie, who you mentioned. She is the main other horse in this race because she was a Grade 1 winner last year in that La Troyenne. Now, she tailed off towards the end of the year, and what you say about Steve Asmussen's stats off layoffs is totally true. It's really not his forte, but you can point out with this filly specifically that the two best races that she's ever run were arguably when she came off layoffs last year in the Bayakoa and the La Troyenne. Now, it wasn't a 7-month layoff like she's dealing with here, but still, she obviously has run well fresh in the past, and given her tactical speed, I think She's a Julie is going to be dangerous here, so I would use her in a big way, and I also think the number 3, Aw Emma, is dangerous in this race. Maybe she's just not good enough, but Aw Emma has run some speed figures that put her in the conversation here in the past. She ran okay in that La Troyenne last year. I know she was beaten a long way by She's a Julie, but she carved out a decent pace that day. She had been impressive last year in some races at Oaklawn Park. I know it seems like Aw Emma's form tailed off this winter, but she had some trouble in a few races. She lost her rider 3 back. I don't know what the plan was in the Apple Blossom last time, but Coriolanary rode her like she was a closer. He never showed any initiative in the early stages, she broke fine that day, but he just kind of reined her in, wanted to take her to the back of the pack. That didn't really work out for her. She ran pretty well 2 back, considering that she didn't get out of the gate that well. She stumbled at the start and actually came from off the pace for the first time in her career, but this time, if she breaks cleanly, I think Aw Emma's going to be out wigging on the front end, and I wouldn't dismiss her at a big price in this race.
No, she was the horse I actually spent the most time with, and I would include her in my tickets as well for all the reasons you mentioned. When I first saw the pace projector and knowing her recent races, I was a little bit surprised to see her on such a clear lead, but there really is a good reason for it. She has shown the most early speed in the places where she's had a chance to do it. That last ride really was baffling. I went and watched a replay, kind of half expecting to see a horse who just maybe lost interest, but I don't think that was the case. She just kind of got taken back a little bit early and from there got shuffled back, and she actually was still running at the end. So I don't think it's a case of a horse who just doesn't want to run anymore and has lost her speed more than tactics. So I have no problem with all Emma. She was also the third horse for me. The only other thing I want to mention, you talked about She's a Julie off a layoff. She also won easily first time out back at Churchill and as a juvenile. So I always kind of consider that the ultimate layoff. Horses that can win first out usually do pretty well off layoff, so she also has that going for her.
Let's move on to the next stakes race on this Churchill Downs card on Saturday. It's the 8th race, the Tepin Stakes for the 3-year-old fillies going a mile on the turf, and we've got some good ones in here. A couple of the best 2-year-old fillies from last year on the turf are now 3-year-olds competing in this race, those being the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Fillies winner, Sharing, along with Alms, the number 14 on the outside. She is actually undefeated in 4 career starts and has won 3 stakes already. So they're the 2 big names in this race, and I thought they actually looked pretty good in this field. And while it's a big, congested group of 14 runners, I thought these were the 2 standouts.
Yeah, I do want to get your thoughts after I finish on this, doing the co-morning line favorites. I've never been a big fan of that, and I'm curious as a morning line maker how you handle that, or if you ever do that. I prefer to see, maybe just make one 5-2, whatever. But anyway, I'll leave that to you to talk about. I'm kind of with you. They do look like the 2 best horses. I am going to use one other one. I'm a little bit leery of Alms. I mean, drawing out in the parking lot, it's not going to be an easy post going a mile. She's not a horse who has to make the lead or anything. As a matter of fact, I don't expect her to make the lead, but she does have some tactical speed, and there's always that danger she would get hung out wide on the first turn and cause some problems. So for that reason, I do prefer Sharing a little bit. Alm does have the better speed figure on our numbers. She ran a 113 last time out in that win at Fairgrounds, whereas Sharing only got a 106 in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Filly Turf, but that was quite a while ago. She was a 2-year-old, so I do expect some improvement. The other horse I am going to use looking for a price is the 5, Hendy Woods. She's won both of her career starts so far. She's done it pretty easily, and I just like the way she's done it. She looks professional. She looks like she has more in the tank. She did get a 107 for that win last time, so if she's anywhere near that 12-1, I'll even have a win bet on her. I'm not sure we're going to get that, but she's definitely one I'm going to use on my horizontal tickets.
I would never make 2 horses the same price as the favorite on the morning line. That's one of my cardinal sins, so you won't see that from me. I think that the morning line maker's job is not to insert himself or herself too much into the race, but you are supposed to have some sort of point of view, I think, and making a morning line favorite or one morning line favorite is part of that job. I really just have 2 rules for myself. One is there's one morning line favorite, and the other is I never make horses 7-5 and 3-2 or 3-2 and 8-5 on the same morning line, because who wants to deal with fractions and do all that math? That's just being evil. So those are my only 2 rules as a morning line maker. As for your comments on the contenders, we're on the exact same page in this race. I think Sharing does have a right to take a step forward. I mean, she's going to be one of the shorter prices in this race, if not the outright favorite. But I actually thought she looked pretty good last year. I mean, I didn't like her in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, Fillies Turf, but she convinced me that day, and she seemed like a really mature 2-year-old who can go on and do some nice things as a 3-year-old. Graham Motion has good stats off these kinds of layoffs, especially in turf routes. So I'll use her. And Alms, I mean, I was concerned at one point that she might not want to go this far, but in her last couple of starts, she's proven that a mile is no problem for her. The post is obviously a concern, and Paco Lopez is going to have to work some of his magic to get her over from the outside. We'll see if he cuts anybody off in doing so, but he's going to try. But I think they're the 2 most talented horses in the race, and I totally agree with you. If there's one other horse that I think is interesting at a price, it is that number 5, Hendy Woods, just because we don't really know how good she is yet. her last speed figure, that 107 TimeformUS number, that puts her in the mix here, and she obviously still has room for better. And I just like what I've seen from her. She's still a little bit green in her races. She's one of those daughters of Uncle Mo that looks like she's got kind of spider legs. I mean, they're going in all directions. And she was changing leads about 5 times in the stretch when she won that allowance race last time. Kind of reminded me of that Japanese filly Amandai, who does the same thing when she runs races like that. But Declan Carroll really wasn't asking for her best until late in that race, and I think that she could take a step forward, but she's going to have to, because there are some good ones in this race.
Yeah, the only other note I had on that race was about Graham Motion with his being a good move for him coming off the layoff. I didn't look it up in Formulator just because in TimeformUS he's a 77 overall trainer, which is a good solid trainer, but he's a 98 off of this kind of layoff. So that's enough for me to know if I did open Formulator that it's going to be fine. So I didn't waste the time on that.
Yeah, I do just want to get your take on one other horse that I think could take some money in this race, the number 7 Outburst. I know she's a horse that we were both interested in the Florida Oaks last time, and she ended up getting bet down to 2-1, which I remember she was like an 8-1 morning line that day. Made sense, though, because she looked so good in her U.S. debut. I'm a little bit skeptical of the quality of that Florida Oaks, though. I know the speed figure didn't come back that high, and we were kind of wondering about it at the time, but after Walk in Marrakesh came back next time, it was a little bit dull. I just wonder if maybe this is a tougher spot for her.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I didn't really like her being on the lead last time. I think she kind of got it by default and thought maybe it's not the best style, and I don't expect her to be on the lead this time. But that said, I'm with you. Even though it was a grade 3 race and this is an ungraded stakes, I think that was a much weaker race. There was a reason she was 2-1 in there. Her speed figures haven't been good enough to really be a contender in here, and she'd need to take a really big step forward. And for me, that would just be too big of a leap. At what I expect she's going to get bet. I mean, she's only 5-1 on the morning line, and she's probably going to be around that when they go off. So I think she'll be a big underlay in here.
Up next, the middle leg of this Pick 5 sequence is the 9th race. It's the Blame Stakes for the older horses going a mile on the dirt. That's 1 turn at Churchill Downs, and this has drawn a pretty intriguing field. You've got some turnbacks in here, some horses that are returning from layoffs. The morning line favorite is the number 8, Owen Dale, and I think it's fair to say that Owen Dale has the most upside of all of these horses because he's a newly turned 4-year-old, and he did some really nice things as a 3-year-old. I just think you have to ask yourself, is this really the target with him, and is a 1-turn mile going to suit this horse?
Yeah, I'll get to him in a minute. This is a race on the pace projector we have as a fast pace projected. I think it's mostly because it's just a big, huge field, more so than just a plethora of early speed. I mean, there is always some speed horses in here, but I don't think it's going to be too crazy. Just when I looked at the PPs, it's just crazy how deep this field is. I think every single horse in the field is a stakes winner, most of them graded stakes, except for Everfast, and he was second in the Preakness last year. So it's just the crazy times now. You're not going to see this kind of race very often for a listed stakes race, but just deep. And we could literally spend an hour on this race talking about each horse one by one. They all have some virtues that could win. And this is a kind of race in a field like this. I like to find a horse that I really think is going to be overlooked and key on that one. It's very tough to pick the winner of a race like this, but when you're right, you want to get paid. So for me, that horse in here is American Anthem. I really think he ran well last time. I think he's run 2 of his better races since moving to the Danny Gargan barn. And I just expect a really good effort from him. He draws a good post for a big field like this. He's outside. He can kind of sit off of it and see what happens. And he's the one I'm going to be keying on.
Yeah, I mean, he's a contender in this race. As you said, we can go through a lot of these horses, and I guess we should try to touch on as many as we can briefly at the least. I'll start by commenting on that Stymie Stakes that Diamond King and American Anthem come out of, since that's where you began. I thought Diamond King ran the best race that day. I mean, I didn't see anything from American Anthem to suggest that he had an excuse in that race, but as you say, he's going to be the bigger price of the two, I would think, and I would put nothing by Danny Gargan. I mean, he can certainly get horses to perform at a high level and wins at a high rate. It's just, I was expecting a little bit more from American Anthem when he came to New York over the winter. I did not like his toboggan that much. He just didn't have the early speed that he once showed for Bob Baffert when he came back in the Danny Gargan barn that day. And it was kind of the same story on the Stymie last time. I thought he had his chance to get by Diamond King, and he just couldn't do it. Now, maybe he takes another step forward, but I've never thought that this horse was really best at a mile. So I'm being a little bit too nitpicky on a horse that's going to be in the 15-1 range. So I'm not going to try to talk you off a long shot. He's definitely a horse that I'm going to use. I'm just trying to say that I prefer Diamond King, and Diamond King, he's 10-1 in the morning line. I mean, to me, that seems like way too big of a price because Diamond King has run plenty of speed figures in the 120 range or above that make him a major player in this race. And the thing that we've always said about Diamond King is that they try him in all these two-turn races, going even as far as a mile and an eighth on some occasions, and he really is just a better one-turn horse and probably best going a one-turn mile, and they did that in the Stymie last time. He won that race probably at an overlaid 4-1. He's drawn on the outside here, and I totally agree with what you said about the pace projector. I think it's predicting a fast pace, mostly because it's such a large field. I don't really see that many confirmed frontrunners in this field, and I think that Diamond King is probably going to be in that position out towards the front end. He's not going to be crawling, but he's going to be going the kind of pace that I think is within his capabilities, and I think he's dangerous to wire this field. I do want to get your take on Owen Dale, who I started with. I don't really think this horse is going to be best going the one-turn mile. Now, maybe he's just got a class edge over this field because he competed in some of those Grade 1 races for the 3-year-olds last year, but for me, he's got to step up a little bit, and I don't know that he's going to get the kind of pace that he needs going this shorter distance.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of his. If you look through his PPs and see who his wins came against last year, in the Oklahoma Derby, he beat Sleepy Eyes Todd and Chess Chief. I mean, that's nothing, no great shakes. In the Ohio Derby, he beat Math Wizard and Long Range Toddy. So, was he really beating anything better than what he's going to face here? I don't think so. He ran a nice second in, I guess it was the Clark last winter, or late fall, when he finished second behind Tom's d'Etat, but he was well back in that race. So this is a race I'm going to swing for the fences because there's 4 horses on the morning line that are single-digit odds, and I don't particularly love any of them. Of those 4, I would probably give Global Campaign the biggest shot. He probably has the most upside, but I think he's going to get bet pretty hard just off that 3-year-old form. Backyard Heaven is 6-1 on the morning line. I don't like this horse at all. He moves out of the Chad Brown barn. He seemed to have completely lost interest after winning the Ali Sheba back last year. It might have even been 2 years ago. Now that I think about it, it was quite a while back, so I don't want any parts of him. Mr. Money spent the better part of his 3-year-old season beating up on basically grade 3 foes and hasn't come through against better horses. And again, even though this is a listed stakes, it could easily be a grade 2 with the field that it drew. So it's one I'm going to swing. I have no problems with Diamond King either, as you were talking about. He's certainly going to be on my tickets, and it's one where I'm going to shoot for some prices.
Yeah, we're on the same page about a lot of the horses you mentioned. Mr. Money, I think you're right. During the summer last year, they just kind of took the path of least resistance, and I think it made people think that he was a better horse than he actually was. Now, you can try to make excuses for Mr. Money being on a wet track last time. I just didn't like that performance, and I just wonder if maybe he's not as good as some people thought he was. I do, of those short-priced horses that you went through, I like Global Campaign the most, and if I had to make a top pick in this race, it would be Global Campaign just over Diamond King, and I'll see what prices they are. I do think Global Campaign is going to be the much shorter price, but they'd be my top 2 choices in this race. Global Campaign, like you said, he's just got the upside. I thought he was really game to win that allowance race going 7 furlongs last time because he actually had some trouble keeping up in the early stages when they went that very fast second quarter mile, but he grinded down those foes and got it done that day. I think a mile is probably the best distance for him, and if he's as forwardly placed as the pace projector indicates, I think that's going to work out pretty well for him. So, and the other thing about him is if you look up in Formulator, I want to mention this. One of the things I like about the new Formulator is that you can look up trainer stats second off a layoff under specific circumstances. And I looked up Stanley Huff second off 6 month or more layoffs, or 180 days or more, and he's actually 3 for 6 since he started training again with a $7 ROI. So he's done this well with a bunch of horses in it, with a few horses in his barn. So I think Global Campaign could take a step forward here. The only other horse that I would even give a brief mention to is the number 7 Silver Dust. Maybe he's just a fairground specialist these days, but I do think the mile is probably a good distance for him. Don't know if he's quite fast enough to beat these horses, but I think just the trip could work out for him in this race.
Yeah, he's run pretty well at the 1-turn mile. When he had the chance at Churchill, it was an off the turf race. But for me, I'm just not sure he's quick enough. I think he's going to take some money. I say he is one I left out of the single-digit morning line horses, but it wouldn't shock me if he won. It probably wouldn't shock me pretty much if any horse in here won, outside of maybe Backyard Heaven or Long Range Toddy, who seems to be off form. But otherwise, it's just such a deep race. We've talked about how many different directions you could go, but I think the key takeaway is you really want to swing for a price in here.
Moving on to the 10th race on this card, the second to last leg of this sequence. It's the Grade 3 Matt Winn, which is now offering, I believe, 50 Derby points, qualifying points to the winner of this race to get into that September Kentucky Derby. And it's drawn a pretty nice field. Obviously, the main attraction in this race is the number 10 Maxfield. This is a horse that I know a lot of people liked heading into that Breeders' Cup Juvenile last year. He was one of the few horses that had to be a vet scratch the week of that race, and it's taken them a while to get him back to the races. They've certainly taken their time with him, but all reports are is that he's training well and he's gone on from the 2-year-old to 3-year-old season. I think you just have to ask yourself, is he going to take that step forward? Because if you're looking purely at speed figures, he doesn't have any kind of edge over this field, but there's just kind of that hype factor with a horse like him.
Yeah, he's obviously talented, and I guess he has to be the horse to beat. And I think there's two ways you can look at it. He either isn't fully cranked off the long layoff, and he won't be ready to fire his best shot and show that improvement that he's going to need. Or you could look at it and say that he really needs the points to make the Derby, which is clearly a goal for them. Now, you could argue that there's plenty of races down the line to get points, but I think this would be the easiest spot he's going to face. But that said, this is the kind of horse I love to take on. I don't think he has any particular strong edge over the field. And then when I looked, I think next on the morning line was Pneumatic. He's another horse that clearly has potential, but I don't want any kind of short price on him. I mean, he's 4-1 on the morning line. That wouldn't be enough for me. So the horse that interests me the most is actually New York Traffic. I think his last race was totally legit. He wasn't able to beat Wells Bayou that day, but he ran very well to hang on for second. He's shown up on the lead with another horse in the pace projector, the 4-horse whose name I forget right now. But it's a horse who he's clearly superior than, and he's going to be drawn outside of him. So I don't think that horse poses any kind of particular danger. So I think New York Traffic could very well get overlooked as the fastest horse in the field.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that we're going to have to deal with this year, especially as we didn't get the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, which would have been run already in a normal year. And you're going to have to make the determination for yourself how much these early season Derby preps really matter anymore. Because in a typical year, you're going to see some newcomers, come onto the scene later in the summer or late spring and just usurp the horses that did well in the Derby preps. That's just kind of natural. And I think you have to determine how strong you thought some of those races were. Now, I didn't love the Louisiana Derby field or really any of those fairgrounds races. I know that some horses came back to do okay. There was that Brett Calhoun, winner of the Oaklawn Stakes. I didn't think that was one of the strongest stakes that we saw. So, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit wrong about that, but I don't know. I just don't love the Louisiana Derby as a race. Obviously, Wells Bayou came back to disappoint next time. And if I was going to take a horse out of the Louisiana Derby, it would be the other horse that you alluded to, Major Fed, who's on the outside here. I watched that race back and I thought he had more trouble than he actually did. He was off a little bit slowly, but I thought Joel Rosario gave him a really good ride thereafter, just kind of was patient and he passed some tired horses at the end. Now, he should be more forwardly placed here if he breaks cleanly, but again, he's in the outside post and that's not ideal for a horse like him. I mean, I've got no major knock against New York Traffic. I know his last out speed figure puts him in the mix. I saw some other speed in this race, especially from Celtic Striker towards the inside. Some cheaper speed, albeit, but some horses that might be able to go with him. And he's just not my favorite. I'm looking elsewhere in this field. When I initially took a glance at this race, I thought yeah, I'm going to try to bet against Maxfield and take on somebody else. But as I went deeper into it, I just couldn't latch on to the other horses as alternatives. And my gut tells me that even though Maxfield hasn't run a big speed figure yet, he is actually pretty good. I was really impressed by that Breeders' Futurity last year. Gouverneur Morris has turned out to be okay. And the reports are that Maxfield has been training really well. I mean, he's been in training forever. They've been ready to run him for a long time, and it's just the schedule that hasn't worked out. So I do think he's fit for this race. He's going to get paced to close into. I wouldn't bet him to win at a short price, but if I'm thinking about multi-race sequences, this is a situation where I would just use Maxfield as the only A and maybe use some others as backups. Those horses that I would use as backups are, as I said, Major Fed. I think he's interesting. I've got no problem with the number 2, Pneumatic. I was skeptical of him stretching out last time, but he proved me wrong. He did it well. He went wide around the turn. The Steve Asmussen Bard has been a little bit cold over the past couple months. If you look up those stats in Formulator, I think you can see that across the board. They haven't been winning a lot of races, not at their usual rate, but this horse has done well for them. And the one other horse I want to throw in is the number 1, Mystic Guide. As you know, I liked this horse's maiden win at the fairgrounds last time, and he does have to run faster, but he's one that I think still has plenty of upside, could take a step forward. He's going to get some pace to close into, and he's got that awesome pedigree that suggests the sky's the limit. So I think we could see a better effort out of him.
Yeah, the only one thing I do want to mention, the figures would tend to indicate you're right about the Louisiana Derby. Wells Bayou, he did basically run the same figure at Oaklawn that was only good enough for 5th. I just don't think this is a very strong field. I don't want to give the impression that I'm not using Maxfield. If I'm playing horizontals, I absolutely have him on my ticket because I think he's the most likely winner. I just, as you said, there's no way I'm betting him to win. He's not going to be 5-2 as he is on the morning line. I think he's probably more 7-5 at best, maybe 8-5 if you're really lucky. So that's why I went in another direction. But it's a race I would spread probably 3 or 4 deep. I might use Major Fed. I definitely will use New York Traffic, and I'll make him my top pick. But I would use horses like Maxfield, Pneumatic in horizontal bets for sure.
And we're going to close things out at Churchill with the final leg of this sequence, the 11th race. It's the War Chant for the 3-year-old Colts and Geldings, going a mile on the turf. And I hope that you were able to narrow things down a little bit in the first 4 legs of this sequence, because this one is really tough to wrap your head around. For me, this has to be a spread race because it's just hard to narrow down the contenders in here. There are so many of them. The short prices on the morning line are horses like Field Pass, who's coming off that win in the Jeff Ruby Stakes over Synthetic. Hieronymus, the number 6 horse, is one that figures to take a lot of money for Brad Cox, coming off 3 straight victories at the fairgrounds. Though I think we do have to discuss the pace of this race because there's quite a bit of speed for a turf race, especially a turf route around here.
Yeah, this is a race the pace projector has labeled as a fast pace, and it's really hard to argue with it. Just seeing a horse like Hieronymus is shown back and forth, a horse who has won his last 3 or 4 races, all going wire to wire. I think all 4 of his career wins have been in that fashion, and that doesn't bode well for him. He could very well make the lead. On turf, oftentimes it comes down to just how determined the jockey is to get it, but I think he'll pay a price for doing so. So this is a race where I'm going to lean on horses who like to come from off the pace. I don't really have any knocks on Field Pass. He's done nothing wrong this year, winning both starts. He got a nice figure in that Jeff Ruby Stakes, 116 TimeformUS. It's hard to say if that'll translate back to turf, if the surfaces are, if he handles both surfaces similarly. But he's a horse I'll definitely use on my tickets. The one I looked to when I went for a price is South Bend. He admittedly disappointed last time, but he's a horse who had run really well in his turf races until that last one. And when I went and watched the replay, it was just an ugly trip. He had what I would... I seem to remember Andy Beyer wrote in one of his books, maybe Trip Handicapping, where he talks about trip handicapping, the wide trip to nowhere, where he was just basically wide around the first turn and got wider all the rest of the way and lost a lot of ground. So if I was looking for a price horse, he's one who I think is going to save ground and put in a much better effort than he did last out.
Yeah, we have the exact same top pick in this race. I think South Bend is very interesting. He actually ran pretty well in some of those stakes at Gulfstream earlier in the winter behind horses like Field Pass, who's in it today. He barely lost to him. Vitalogy, Decorated Invader, who's arguably one of the best turf horses, turf 3-year-olds out there. And I mean, I agree. Just go back and watch that trip last time, especially coming to the top of the stretch. I mean, he had to be 10 wide and just got bumped there. I mean, off stride. He's getting his regular rider, Julian Leparoux, back on in this race. He's actually drawn a much better post position than he usually does down on the inside. So if he gets pace to close into, I think this could be the day that he breaks through and gets back to the winner's circle. And he'll be a price in here because I'm not thrilled with some of these horses that have speed that are going to take money, like Hieronymus, who we mentioned. I mean, Billy Bats is a short price on the morning line. I have trouble seeing a horse like him work out the right trip with all the speed he has. The same goes for Smooth Like Straight, who's a horse who has some troubles getting the mile, maybe on his best day when the pace doesn't work out, and I don't think it's going to work out in his favor here, so I have a bit of trouble seeing him getting the right trip. And like you, I just want to focus on closers. I mean, Field Pass is the logical one, but there are some others like the number 12 Pixelate. He's coming out of some similar races with Hieronymus, but he just has a much better running style than Hieronymus, and he's getting Joel Rosario aboard, who typically is so good in these situations, guiding horses from off the pace in large fields like this. So I would definitely use Pixelate, and I would even, maybe on some smaller tickets, use the number 7 Bama Breeze, who just looks way too slow to win a race like this, but I think it's interesting that they originally targeted a non-winners of one allowance race against some older horses, where he also looked to be a little tough against some faster horses last week in a race that was rained off the turf. But if you go back and watch his maiden victory and his debut for Ben Colebrook at Churchill last year, he was very visually impressive that day, was in traffic for much of the race, got through way too late. He might just not be good enough, and maybe this spot is way too ambitious off the layoff, but he's a horse that does have ability, so I'll use him as a backup somewhere because he's going to be a gigantic price.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up because I knew we talked about him last week and then that race got washed off. And on our podcast last week, I did kind of warn people to take that figure with a grain of salt. It was the only turf race on the day. It was for lately raced 2-year-olds. So it was as close to being an impossible to figure to make as you're going to get. So he's certainly going to be on my tickets, and I think he's going to run well. Whether he's good enough to win a race like this, we'll see. But at the price, you can't pass him up. That said, I guess it's time to move to Santa Anita, and I kind of took the reins there because I know you want to talk about the second race and have a horse you love. I suspect we may be landing on the same horse, so I don't want to steal your thunder, and I'll let you start with that second race from Santa Anita.
Yeah, if you guys watch the Horses to Watch segment that I do for DRF.com, you'll notice that one of the horses that I highlighted recently is in this race, and that's the number 4 Believe Now. This is a horse that it's worth going back to watch his debut because, well, first of all, recognize that Mike McCarthy is not a trainer that really has first-time starters cranked up to win their debuts, and this horse took a little bit of money that day, was bet down to 9-2, and things just didn't really work out for him. He was off with the field, but maybe about a length slowly into stride, and Joel Rosario tried to push him in the early stages to get position, but he ended up getting a little bit too rank under him down the backstretch, raced up into traffic, got shuffled back around the far turn. They got to the top of the stretch, and he was just taking a ton of dirt in his face behind a wall of horses. Joel had to really alter course a couple of times to get him out into the clear on the outside, and he only got to daylight with about a 16th of a mile left in the race, and he really took off at that point. He only finished 4th, but he quickly galloped out past the entire field into the clubhouse turn, and he's just bred to be a horse that wants to go a little bit longer than this. He was a very expensive yearling purchase, so there have been high hopes for him. It seems like he's trained well, and Mike McCarthy has excellent statistics second time out with maidens, especially on the dirt if you look them up in formulators. So to me, I know there are some horses in this race that have already run faster in routes, but I think this horse is a very likely winner because he's going to take that step forward, and I think the distance is going to help him.
Yeah, we're on the same page, and that's why I wanted you to go first. I had seen your segment, of course, and there's not a whole lot for me to add. One of the things I was proud of being able to get in our TimeformUS trainer stats was that when a horse runs back second time, we show what the trainer does first time. And Mike McCarthy is actually rated a 44 on a scale of 1 to 100, where he's a 99 second time out. I'm still trying to push to get the reverse, where horses show up the first time. I think that's something people will want to see, that first time out the horse shows a 44, but we know he's probably going to run better second out, so you might want to avoid him. So I still fight with the bosses over that. We'll get it eventually because I'm pretty persistent on those kind of things. He's also a 99 sprinter route rating, which we're getting here. So I don't have a whole lot to add in here. Divine Armor comes in with the best fig, but it's a race that we have flagged as suspect, and it's probably still in that category. Some horses have run back, but it's still a bit ambiguous, so it's one we'll keep an eye on. But it's certainly not a figure I'd want to take a short price on, and Divine Armor probably will be that. Muralist might be an alternative in here. He kind of closed well into a slow pace last time, but I'm not sure he's fast enough. He's been running most of his races on turf, so I'm with you. Believe Now, I think, is a very likely winner in this field.
Yeah, you covered the two other contenders well. I think there are some chinks in each of their armor, especially Muralist, who's coming out of what I thought to be a pretty weak race for the older horses, facing some 3-year-olds in here. So I don't know if we're going to get that 5-2 morning line on Believe Now. I kind of think there's a chance that a lot of people might see what I see it. He could be the favorite in this race, but it's not going to be like he's a prohibitive favorite if he is. So I think he's the right one in there. Let's move on to those two turf stakes that are taking place later in the day at Santa Anita. They're at very different distances. One's a sprint, another's going 1.25 miles. We'll start with the shorter one. That's the 5th on the card, the Grade 3 Daytona. Usually this is run down the hill at Santa Anita, but since they're not running those races right now, this one's going the 5.5 furlongs. And this is a pretty competitive field. You've got really 4 major players in this race. I see that Wildman Jack is the favorite on the morning line. I was a little bit surprised about that. I guess people might be seeing his big effort last time out in Dubai and put a lot of stock in that. I don't know. I thought, though, Sistrom was probably the horse to beat because he's got that good recent performance off the layoff last time, beat a really nice runner and Bound to Nowhere, and he just seems like he's a solid turf sprinter that's going to work out a favorable trip.
Yeah, and he's also shown he can sprint on dirt. Not that that matters today, unless for some odd reason it rained in Southern California, but he's the most talented horse in the field. He also looks like he has a tactical edge. He's shown in the pace projector on a clear lead, and he's a horse that we know doesn't even need the lead, but he can take it when it's handed to him and win. So I think he's going to be really tough. I'm leery of Wildman Jack. He did get a 120 Timeform rating for that win over in Dubai. But if there's one rating I'm skeptical of coming from Timeform, it's the turf sprints. The horses just generally aren't as good as our horses here. We see it. I don't think we've ever had one win the Breeders' Cup Turf. Even the juveniles, they consistently get bet. So I just don't trust those races over there. I don't think he's as good as Sistron and probably some others in here. If I was going to lean on a second horse, it would be Stubbins. He's a horse who basically had no chance in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. He's a horse who has that big closing style, and that was a race where Belvoir Bay set a reasonably moderate pace, particularly considering it was a Breeders' Cup race, and Stubbins just had no chance. But that said, he was absolutely flying through the lane. He comes back for Doug O'Neill, who does fine in these situations. I still think he's a bit against it due to the projected pace in here. But if I wanted another horse, it would be him, because I think he is the second best horse in the field.
Yeah, I would actually make Stubbins my top pick in this race. I'm interested to see how they ride Sistron, because last time out he broke very well, and it seemed like Victor Espinoza had a plan to rein him in off the pace. There was another kind of cheaper speed horse in there, and Bound for Nowhere who also had speed, so maybe they were thinking that was the right situation that day. I just wonder how aggressive they're going to be with Sistron, because he does seem to be equally as effective on the lead as he is stalking the pace. So maybe that gives Wildman Jack an advantage, but I still agree with you. I'm not going to put too much stock in that Dubai race last time, given just it was a different set of circumstances. And I agree about Stubbins' trip in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. He did save all the ground on the rail at the back of the pack, but if you watch that race, basically until the 8th pole, or even after that, maybe the 16th pole, Flavien Prat just had nowhere to go on him and basically had a ton of horse underneath him with nothing to do with it. And there's an argument that if he had gotten clear sooner, or had somehow worked his way outside, he could have made it pretty close because he had a ton of run once he finally got into the clear. I'm a little bit concerned about the pace, but I don't think he has to come from as far back as maybe his last couple of races with bigger fields would indicate. So I just think he's, in terms of raw talent, very much the other horse in this race, and I'd make him my top pick at a better price.
Yeah, and I don't want to, and I actually think the small field helps him, as you mentioned. It's certainly tougher for closers in those huge fields. Sometimes you get more pace, but you still have more traffic to maneuver through. I don't want to totally overlook Texas Wedge either. He ran very well at Gulfstream earlier this year. He comes in off 2 wins in a row. He has solid speed figures. He ran a 120 last time, and he's trained by Peter Miller, who just seems to own these races. So if I'm playing the early pick 5 at Santa Anita, there's no way I get knocked out by not having Texas Wedge on my ticket.
Yeah, Texas Wedge is the kind of horse that I would say he scares me because I know that Peter Miller does win races like this, even with horses that might look a little bit inferior. But just from a handicapping perspective, I can't quite make him the pick in this race because I know he won that grade 2 back at Santa Anita. That was a grade 2 that's definitely weaker than this grade 3 that he's in today. That just really hasn't come out to be a strong field, and he got a perfect trip to win that Gulfstream race last time. So I think he's got to step forward, but he definitely scares me. We'll finish things up with one more from Santa Anita. That's the other stakes on this Saturday card. The Charles Whittingham Grade 2 event going 1.25 miles on the turf, starting a little ways up the hill before they connect up with the main track. And this one, the favorite is going to be the number 5, United, in all likelihood. And United is kind of turned into the center of the California turf division in these marathon races, just sort of by default because there's not a whole lot going on in a lot of these races. He did finish a very good second in the Breeders' Cup Turf last year to Bricks and Mortar, but his 2 races since then, they've been okay, and I don't love the competition that he's facing. There are a couple of new faces in here that I think could make him more vulnerable than he's been.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, he is the horse to beat. He can certainly win the race, but is he worth even money or less? I have a hard time seeing that. He hasn't run particularly fast. His only big speed figure was in the Breeders' Cup Turf, where he was beating that head when he got a 126. But that was, at a half mile further or quarter mile further than we're running on Saturday. And he's solid. He can win, but I'm going to try to beat him. And a couple horses that I actually like in here to beat him. The first one is Originaire. I really liked his last performance. I know it was just an allowance race, and I know that he got a great pace to run into. All the fractions are coded in red, but I just loved his late kick. I don't think he's going to have any problem handling that extra furlong to 1.25 miles. And I just love the way his figures are improving every single time out. And particularly in California, it is almost the norm where you see horses jump out of allowance races to win graded stakes. So that doesn't scare me at all. I'm not in love with the 5-2 price, but I'm not sure he's going to be quite that low. And the other horse I'm interested in is Rock Emperor, who ships in for Chad Brown. He comes out of that Fairground Stakes race, the Muniz Memorial, which was won by Factor This. And even though the pace looked solid numerically, it was just a race that didn't have a lot of flow to it. He was really the only horse flying at the end. So I think he's interesting. He's also 5-2 on the morning line. So for me, this is a race where you just kind of have to watch the tote and see what you're really going to get. It's kind of tough to say. It's a very contentious race, and I'll be looking to see if any of them offer some value.
Yeah, Originaire is an interesting horse because he's actually shown a little bit closer than you would have anticipated on the pace projector. He's shown in 3rd place in the early going, actually ahead of United. Part of that might be due to the fact that he's coming out of some shorter races because he is a deep closing type. I have trouble taking a horse that got such a perfect setup last time, now finding himself in basically what amounts to a paceless race going a longer distance. That just doesn't usually work out. I agree with you that he showed some talent, and it seems like he's finally, just finding himself for Jeff Mullins. But I wonder if the trip is going to work out. And for me, the 7 Rock Emperor is very much the right horse in this race. He showed a ton of ability in the Belmont Derby last year, closing to be third, but getting anything but a good trip in that race. He was wide, coming from last in a 14-horse field. And I agree with everything you said about his Muniz Memorial last time. That was just a race where nobody closed. And the pace, I thought, was more on the slow to moderate side, and it didn't work out for him. Also, that was just a mile and an eighth, and I really think he's the kind of horse that just gets going at a mile and a quarter. He was targeted at like some longer distances even when he was in Europe. I really think that the added ground is going to suit him. And Irad Ortiz comes in for Chad Brown. I think that's a good sign. It's good placement by Chad Brown to find this race for a horse like this because he doesn't ship out to California that often. I did notice that I think this is the only mount that Irad Ortiz has at Santa Anita on Saturday. I'm assuming that's because there are rules about riders coming in from other circuits and how many races they can ride. I think I read something about that. So he might only be allowed to ride this one race, but that doesn't deter me at all. I mean, I think Irad Ortiz can give 1 out of 1 good rides per day.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. One other horse I want to mention, just because it's interesting, is Multiplier. He's back in the entries just a week later after we talked about him. He was unable to win that allowance race, but what I found interesting was it kind of underscored how weak the Santa Anita handicap was this year. He ran second in that Santa Anita handicap and got a 117 TimeformUS speed figure. He finished third behind Axeman last Saturday and ran a 118. So just an interesting little note that really doesn't have much to do with this race. I don't give Multiplier much of a chance at all in here either this Saturday if he does indeed run, but just an interesting horse for me.
Yeah, I'd agree with your take on him. Well, we found a lot to talk about, unsurprisingly, with these races because there was a lot going on, especially at Churchill Downs. I hope we gave out some interesting ideas for hitting that pick 5 sequence because that's the kind of sequence where if you hit it with any combination of horses, you're likely to make a score because they're just, it doesn't seem like one that's going to be won by all favorites. And even at Santa Anita, while the fields are a little bit smaller, I think there were a lot of contenders in these races. Pretty interesting 7-horse fields there. So hopefully we give out some good ideas and we'll check back in next week when we do the TimeformUS Pacecast because there's going to be plenty of stakes action to recap. Remember that you can always listen to both of those podcasts on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back at you on Tuesday with the TimeformUS Pacecast.